Hello and a big welcome to this panel on audience evaluation of immersive experiences, hosted by Bristol Bath Creative R+D as part of our AHRC cluster. I'm Danaë Stanton Fraser. I'm a co-I on the AHRC cluster, and I'm also a professor in psychology at the University of Bath, where I run the Create Lab, working in the area of human-computer interaction, specifically looking at the design and evaluation of VR and immersive experiences. I'm delighted today to be chairing this panel, a fantastic panel, Ian Gilchrist, Mandy Rose, Matt Freeman, who are all going to introduce themselves now, just briefly.
Hi everyone, I'm Ian Gilchrist. I'm Professor of Neuropsychology at the University of Bristol, and I run an active vision lab at the university, and I'm also part of the Bristol Vision Institute. Over to Mandy.
Hi, I'm Mandy Rose, Professor of Documentary and Digital Cultures at UE Bristol. I'm Director of the Digital Cultures Research Centre at UE Bristol, and also one of 3 co-conveners of the IDOCS project, which investigates interactive and immersive documentary.
Hi, and I'm Matt Freeman. I'm a reader in multi-platform media at Bath University, where I'm co-director at the Centre for Media Research and also lead research across the School of Creative Industry.
Great, thank you. And so we're going to have a panel discussion today, but what I've asked each of the panel members to do is to spend sort of 10 to 12 minutes. If they go over that, I'll try and stop them at no longer than 15. Talking a little bit about the research that they're doing in this area. And then we'll move to some discussion. I'll start with a discussion question I've got, and then I'm very much hoping that people will be happy to pose questions in the Q&A section. And we'll try and answer some of those questions in the discussion at the end. There should be about half an hour for discussion, so hopefully we'll get some lively questions. So I'm really looking forward to the presentations. We're going to ask Ian to present first, then move to Mandy, and then to Matt. So Ian, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen, my slides. Can I just get a nod from panel member so that they can see that?
Yeah, we can see them. And yeah, brilliant.
Right. So thanks very much for this opportunity. It's great to be on this panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other talks and also the discussion. So feel free to pick up on any questions you have about this as we go along. So being a member of an audience, whatever the nature of the thing you're watching or hearing or experiencing, has a whole range of psychological impacts. And we can split these into 2 broad classes. There are psychological impacts which are in the moment. So things like your experience as an audience make you cry or laugh or be scared or confused. It can trigger a memory. You can be watching content which reminds you of something of your past, and you can go off in a mind wander to think about that. And also in the moment, you can become more or less immersed in the content. You can be present and in it, or you can be less of that experience. There are also longer term effects, psychological effects of being part of an audience. The content may change your mood. It might leave you with a long-term memory that you can come back to 10, 20, 30 years later. It might change your behavior. Perhaps watching a film about climate change may mean you recycle more, for instance, and that again can be a long-term effect. It can add to your knowledge. It might be there might be factual content in there which means that you know more after having watched the content than you did before. And of course, it can also change your beliefs about something and widen your horizons. So all of those effects on audience are deeply psychological, and as a psychologist, that's what I'm interested in. Today, I'm going to focus on just one of them, and that's that experience of immersion, that feeling of becoming completely caught up in the content. What is immersion? Well, it's difficult to define, but I personally like this definition, which isn't really a definition of immersion, it's a definition of attention, but I think it captures the psychological phenomenon of what happens when we become immersed. And what William James said back in 1890, who's the brother of Henry James, the famous author, was that it was the taking possession of the mind in clear and vivid form by one of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Quite a Victorian language, but what James is capturing there is that sense of, for instance, when you're watching television like these 2 children are on the slide, that sense of everything else fading out into the background. One thing has caught your attentions, one thing is you've become immersed in. And under those circumstances, anything else that happens in the room, you probably won't be paying attention to. So the house can burn down around you, someone can come in and call you for a meal, or someone can ring on the doorbell because a parcel's about to be delivered, and you won't even notice it because you're completely immersed in the content you're in. When you're in that situation, obviously sometimes you completely miss things, but also you'd be slower to respond to those events that are outside what you're paying attention to. And the more immersed you are, probably the slower you're going to be. So we can use the speed at which, the time at which it takes you to respond as a measure of how much you've got immersed in the current content. Now, there are two things I'd like to add about immersion. One thing is it's multidimensional. You know, that immersion is probably not a unitary thing. You can be completely immersed in it because you're interested in it. You can be completely immersed in something because you are scared about it, or it scares you, or you could be completely immersed in something because you're emotionally engaged in it. So it's not a single dimension. And the other thing is continuous. As you watch a television program, for instance, immersion will wax and wane. Sometimes you'll be completely in the moment, and sometimes you'll pull back from it. And those are the things we're trying to capture and we're interested in. So what we've done is we've developed a method which draws on what I've just described very closely. Participants in our experiments are asked to watch, for instance, a television program. They watch a TV program, and they have their mobile phone with them, and they've got a special app loaded on the mobile phone, and occasionally, at slightly annoying intervals, the mobile phone will bleep at them. And we've programmed it to do that. And when it bleeps, they have to press the button on the mobile phone. And what we're recording is their response time to press the button. So the logic being, a bit like the house burning down around you, or someone or the doorbell going, the slower they are to respond to their bleeping mobile phone, the more immersed they are in the content. And of course, we can do this repeatedly during the content, and we can get a profile over time of what's happening to people's immersion as the media content continues. So I'm going to show you just very quickly, because I'm going to get cut off if I'm not careful, just two quick experiments along those lines, which gives you a sense of how we think about this problem and what the data actually looks like. So we did some work with the BBC, looking at one episode of Planet Earth, the Islands episode, if you know that one. And the BBC were interested, and we're interested in whether how the content was presented, whether that altered the amount of immersion. Don't worry about this graph too much. I'll talk my way through it and it'll help you understand what our design was. We're interested in two factors. One was the spatial resolution of the display, whether it was high definition or ultra high definition. And that's something that people are paying a lot of money for. So we want to know whether that really makes a difference. And the other thing we did was we manipulated whether it was the standard dynamic range or an ultra high dynamic range display. Now, most modern expensive televisions are high dynamic range, which means the darks are darker and the brights are even brighter, and you've got more color depth between those 2 points. And what we had is we had separate participants watch the same content for 40 minutes under 4 different conditions. So it's a combination of those two. They either had the standard dynamic range and the high definition, or the standard dynamic range and the ultra high definition, or the high dynamic range with those 2 resolutions as well. So there's 4 groups of participants. And what these graphs show, what these little lines show, is participants' reaction times across a number of participants, their reaction times to their phone bleeping at them. And you can see that they wax and wane. And where an individual participant is slow, the other participants were also slow. So there's a relationship between the participants. Something about that period in the content is slowing them down. So the wobbliness of this line isn't just noise, it actually corresponds to something changing in the content. What's the take-home message here? Well, the important thing to notice is that our 2 lines, which represent the standard dynamic range, are lower than the high dynamic range. So what that means is the participants who saw high dynamic range content were slower to respond to their mobile phone on average than the ones who had the standard dynamic range. So having a high dynamic range display makes you more immersed in the content than having a standard dynamic range. So it looks like it's worth investing in that technology if you're thinking of buying a new telly. The other comparison we can make is between the definitions, okay? And so under standard dynamic range, the orange line is the ultra high definition and the blue line is the high definition. And there's no reliable difference between these 2 lines. Either for the standard dynamic range or the high dynamic range. So whether you have the more, at this point, number of pixels anyway, adding more pixels doesn't really make you more immersed according to these data. So if you're buying a new TV, don't necessarily go for more pixels, go for more dynamic range, because that seems to be what makes you more immersed. Okay, so that's an example of where the physical properties of the display, how we display the information to the participants, makes a difference to how immersed they are. And here's my second example. This again was work we did with the BBC, and this time we used an episode from Killing Eve, which was great when we did these experiments because no one had watched it, and then it won loads of awards, and now everyone's watched it, so we can't use it anymore. It's an aside. One of the problems with our reaction time measure, we love it, but it slightly breaks the immersion, because every time your phone buzzes at you, you have to press it, you stop paying attention or being so immersed in the content. And so what we wanted to do is to try and develop measures which were completely passive, so they didn't interfere with your viewing experience, but allowed us to do the same kinds of measurements. And this gives you a flavour of the sorts of things we've done. Here's our reaction time measure. We do a memory measure as well, quite often, where participants at the end, having seen the content, say, did you see this version of the still in the image, or did you see this one? And they're just mirror reversed. We record galvanic skin response, which is the method that's used in the lie detector test. If not very popular and not very accurate for a lie detector test, but it does give you a measure of arousal, and it gives you a continuous measure of arousal. We also measure heart rate, and we've also done things to measure the motion of the participants. So we're filming them in infrared and looking at their motion. That won't prove to be very important here, because in this experiment, participants sit very still because they're not really responding to anything in motion terms. So lots of measures, and here's a very similar plot that you saw before, plotting with time on this axis and those different measures. So you can see that reaction time is also fluctuating as it did before. This is our dual task measure that I talked about before. And you can see memory performance changes quite consistently. It's consistent across participants again. This isn't just noise. There are periods where people are better at remembering the content and periods where they're less good at remembering the content. Head speed is just noise. People aren't moving very fast. This is a very small motion. So I'm going to sort of drop that, but I just wanted to tell you about it. Here's heart rate, which is also changing, fluctuating with the content and consistently across participants. And here's that galvanic skin response, the sort of sweatiness of your palm, if you like. And you can see this is also changing in very small units, but this is also changing as the content progresses. It's waxing and waning. And this is phasic GSR, which is a slightly different way of computing the galvanic skin response. Okay, so now we've got a multitude of methods, and only really the reaction time is kind of invasive. We can do all these passively while people are just watching the content or engaging in the content. Now, those of you looking carefully will notice that there's a peak in all of these. It's noisy, but there's a peak. So around this point in the content of this episode, the reaction times become very slow. So it takes people a long time to get back to their mobile phone and press the button when it bleeps at them. It takes, these are bits of the content which are extremely memorable as well. You can see this is memory performance. If the dots are high up on this graph, that means they're doing really well. And you can see there's a real cluster of good memory here. You can also see this is a period where heart rate seems to peak. And you can also see there's a really distinctive peak in the galvanic skin response. And it's also there in the phasic skin response. So here's a period where everything seems to be pulling together. And just for fun, I thought I'd show you that little snippet so you could see what that corresponds to. Now, those who are slightly faint-hearted, you may want to look away at some point here. So you can see there's the peak of the drama within that particular episode culminates in this particularly gruesome and unpleasant assassination of an Italian in Tuscany somewhere. And that's the very point at which all our measures of immersion seem to peak as well, and they correspond across the measures. So all measures are picking up on this same moment, which is psychologically really important for the person watching the content. So in my two examples, what I've tried to do is to capture both an example where the low-level kind of engineering of the display affects your immersion, but that's not the whole story, is it? immersion is also affected by the storytelling, by the content, by the drama itself. And the second example shows clearly that that also has an effect on immersion. And these measures allow us to, over time, track that waxing and waning of audience experience, and particularly the immersive properties of the content. So here's my conclusions. I've nearly run out of time. Immersion is a psychological phenomena, and we're using psychological methods to try and get at it. It's not easy to measure people's mental states while they're immersed and doing something else they want to do. But I think we've got good evidence now across a number of studies, and I've just given you a couple of examples, that we can reliably measure immersion in real time and continuously as it progresses and waxes and wanes during an extended piece of content. And this allows us to track how immersion fluctuates. And that my last point of my conclusion slide is what I said just now, which is that both content and the technology can influence immersion. And the exciting thing to do, I think, into the future probably is to look at the interplay between those two and use these methods to begin to get a fuller and more rounded understanding of the immersive experience. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to stop sharing. And I'm going to hand over to Mandy, who's next.
Okay, and I will start sharing. So I guess you can all see my slides now.
We can.
So yes, so by contrast, I'm going to share some research that's grounded in a humanities approach, more of a kind of cultural studies approach to audience reception. And this was a study that we undertook within the Virtual Realities research project, on which I was co-investigator along with Danae and Key Cater from Bristol. So this was a project that ran for, in the end, for 3 years, from 2017 to 2020. And we came together as an interdisciplinary team to think about what was happening as non-fiction producers were harnessing virtual reality. And as you can see, it's a project with a number of partnerships, both between the 3 universities, University of Bath and Danae, Bristol and Key, and UE Bristol, but also with a number of creative industry partners. I'm just going to take a couple of slides to give you a feeling for the wider project that our study sat within. So there's the team, and we were working with 3 research associates. I worked closely with Dave Green on the study that I'm about to talk about. Dave actually delivered it, and we worked together to design and to analyse it, along with Chris Bevan. So that's the team, and the URL if you want to find out more about it. And here were 3 of our key research questions. The kind of uber question at the top, which was a question we were looking at across the whole project: how might VR, its characteristics of immersion and interaction, take documentary forward? And the particular questions that the research study I'm going to talk about address are around the ways that spatial storytelling might contribute to our ability to kind of witness the real, to witness the lives and worlds of people we're not in direct contact with. And then particularly, how does presence support non-fiction content? How might presence support the ways that media can allow us to understand and engage with people who we are only encountering in a virtual environment? So just very quickly, our study proceeded across the 3 years and across a number of the project proceeded across 3 years and across a number of studies which were led from different parts of this deeply interdisciplinary project, with key coming from computer science, Danae from psychology, human-computer interface, and myself coming from documentary studies, digital cultural studies. So we undertook a number of studies, and just very quickly to flag them, this may be of interest to people, an online mediography where we mapped the first few years of VR nonfiction. You can find that on our website. We commissioned 3 projects to kind of push out the edges of what was possible in a research and for us to look at that in a research context. One of them, Waiting Room VR, won a number of awards, 360 video piece about the experience of breast cancer treatment. Danae and her team ran a number of studies based in experimental psychology, and you can find on our website more information about those studies. So the one I'm going to talk about more now is an audience study that we undertook in Bristol. We really wanted to understand something about VR in context, and here we were interested in the context of the home, the context of, you know, the domestic life that we all lead. So we recruited 35 participants, diverse participants across 12 households in Bristol. To do that, we ran some open days at Norwest Media Centre, Bristol VR Lab, and we engaged with partners, including Refugee Women of Bristol. So, as I say, we were interested in moving from an understanding of what the technology might do to understanding how that might make sense to people in a context, in this context of home. And we wanted to get beyond that kind of initial thrill that people find when they try VR for the first time. So we took a longitudinal approach across 10 weeks, and we equipped people with a VR headset and a curated content, offering them each week a number of VR pieces on a theme. So we've got on the left, I think it was the natural world, we called it. On the right, some videos reflecting human migration, which has been a marked theme within virtual reality, the first few years of virtual reality nonfiction. And in putting together, in curating the content for the study, we looked to the mediography we'd created, which by then offered us a kind of rich sense of where the themes were, where the makers were, where the prize-winning projects were within this landscape of nonfiction VR. So each week, people were invited to try some of the pieces within that week's theme. This is the equipment that we took into those households. And the project began with an in-depth qualitative interview with people within the household as they unboxed the equipment that we brought them. We were using an Oculus Go. Happily, that had just kind of arrived when we were designing the research. You know, an untethered VR headset was really important. And you can see there a kind of the playful inclusion in the box of some of the kind of precursors of virtual reality headsets, the Viewmaster, the stereoscope, which were there sort of as conversation pieces to encourage people to have a sense of the history behind this technology, which is often kind of pushed out as very novel, you know, revolutionary, etc. So so yeah, we began with that one long interview with the household. We invited people to try content each week, and we used social media. Here's some of the participants, and as well as the qualitative recorded interviews that we did face to face, we used some social media approaches. Here, a WhatsApp group through which we encouraged people to watch the content, but also to comment through social media as they went. something which was taken up patchily, was unsurprisingly more something that younger participants tended to engage with more than older participants. Some big headlines on what we found as we through an inductive analysis of the interviews that we did at the end of the project. Sorry, I forgot that. So we began with an in-depth interview. We were in touch through social media during the course of this 10 weeks, and we returned at the end and did a long interview, semi-structured interview, which we then analysed. So the first headline is that there was this very evident sense in what people were telling us, that they made a connection between the affordances of virtual reality, the things that virtual reality enables, between immersion and their sense of connection to understanding of non-fiction content. They weren't necessarily using the word immersion, but there was you can see the connection in what they were saying. And you'll see, and it ran right through the interviews, TV coming up as a reference point, as people were talking about VR, key reference point. So, the display was hugely more powerful than on a flat screen, right? People are comparing this content to how they might experience it on TV or perhaps on their phones or a tablet or wherever. But this comparison, more powerful than on a flat screen. You feel like you are in the middle of thousands and thousands of people. So, presence spoken about without the word being used, but that sense of, a plausible sense of a place. This third quote, VR helps you understand real world problems. And this is an example of a VR piece about poaching. And Dexter says it's a pseudonym for the person. He says, you're wary. In a VR piece, you're wary, actively wary. Whereas you wouldn't be if you were watching a documentary on TV. There's that sense of a feeling of being there, which then provokes the kind of emotions you might have if you were on the scene. So this is our first kind of big takeaway from the research, that the immersion felt to people like a value in their kind of comprehension of, their sense of these real world situations and people and places. And in particular, this notion of presence, this feeling of being there. And in the title on this slide, I mentioned Leacock, and one of the things that was very interesting to us is how this the value of presence, the value that people expressed in presence, in this feeling of being there, links related to a history in documentary where the feeling of being there has precisely been the driving force. So Leacock is Richard Leacock, who's kind of known as the father of direct cinema, who was involved in in harnessing handheld cameras and sync sound in the 1960s, and he called his autobiography "The Feeling of Being There." So there's a kind of interesting sense here that that VR is offering what an earlier version of media technology offered to documentary. That that increased sense of the veracity, the lived experience on screen. So 360 immersion in the rubble somewhere in Syria hits home a lot harder than it does watching on a 48-inch TV, because it's all there, all around you. So you get these kind of linked ideas of, of the power of the material, of the sense of being there. So yeah. So, but at the same time, what came up and was very interesting to us and was, was a common theme in people's interviews were these concerns also about this power of immersion, the concerns about the vulnerability of the audience in the situation of being confronted by this kind of material within the headset. And these concerns were both around issues of trauma, Khadija in the first quote, really telling, I've had to flee. This is somebody who'd had a refugee experience. I've had to run for my life. I don't know if that might trigger a memory. So concerns about PTSD, concerns about trust, concerns that, trust could be manipulated. It felt powerful. You felt like you trusted the content in VR. That could be persuasive, but that's also problematic. It's so realistic, you could end up thinking, well, that's how it is, because I saw it with my own eyes. You know, and obviously in any documentary experience is both, you know, as a level of witness that the camera has done, but also it's a constructed piece. And people were concerned that that constructedness might be obscured within VR. I'm almost there, Danae, just one or two brief slides. Oh yeah. A key, and then, you know, a really significant finding for us was that actually, despite all this enthusiasm, interest, the feeling of how compelling the content was, people actually dropped off. Their usage dropped off really remarkably during the course of the trial, to the extent that only a couple of families of the 12 were still trying the pieces at the end of 12 weeks. And they did so with because of their sense of loyalty to the project rather than to their wish to be trying this content. There were a number of issues. Key was the issue that people felt VR was at odds with the sociality of the home, but also, and this image really is telling, people felt vulnerable being in the headset if they were in the house on their own. So there's a sense of tension with the social life of the family and a sense of vulnerability within the headset. So findings here, both you know, significant potential for non-fiction, and some reservations about the effective power, the emotional power, the persuasiveness of VR. You know, propaganda was even mentioned. People were saying, what if this fell into the wrong hands? And then, you know, this very significant fact that usage dropped away. And we concluded, you know, looking back at kind of media history, that VR at the moment lacks what Brian Winston calls a supervening social necessity, a real need that drives take up. So there are our findings, and I'll look forward to discussing further. Now I'm going to stop sharing and hand to Matt.
Great. Hi, everyone. Just bear with me a second. Cool. Great. Thanks. Yeah, and really great to be here and be able to talk about this. So there's a lot of overlaps actually between what I'm going to talk about, which is very different, but actually picks up on quite a few of those ideas actually that Ian and Mandy were talking about. But as I say, kind of just thinking about them in a slightly different direction or application, I guess. So I'm just going to talk quite briefly about some of the work that I and then a few of the people that I've been working with have been doing kind of over the past year, which is really about, I guess, most broadly trying to think about kind of a bigger audience for the XR sector. This is partly, I guess, about trying to think about how do we sort of change cultural or audience perceptions of what XR is or what it could be. And really the way that we've been thinking about how to do this is about developing new promotion and marketing practices or techniques that are specific to the XR sector. So I'll just pick out a couple of kind of key lessons, a few examples, and a couple of sort of audience insights based on our research, which we're kind of now using, as well as kind of, you know, much broader research we're doing to inform kind of the commercial work that we do as immersive promotion design. So this is a new marketing consultancy for the XR world that's based at the studio, Palace Yard Muse, which is Bath Spa's enterprise and innovation hub. So before I start, I'm just going to quickly show you a very short video that just gives you a little bit more detail about kind of who we are. And
Matt,
yeah.
Matt, we can't see you, so I don't know if you could just click yourself back on the screen if possible as well.
Apologies, it keeps cutting off, doesn't it?
Well, don't worry, just in case.
There we go. Cool. Yeah, so this is a short video about who we are.
We are Immersive Promotion Design, a new breed of consultancy for the XR sector. There's no doubt that the time for immersive technology has come, but the reality is that XR remains difficult to communicate to those who haven't experienced it before. Working to establish a whole new promotional language for marketing virtual, augmented, and mixed reality experiences, we provide audience insight and onboarding, strategy and concept development, and production of promotional assets, whatever your XR project. We are a collective of immersive thought leaders, made up of arts and cultural marketeers, creative producers, researchers and academics, brand and story strategists, creative technologists, digital theatre makers and artists. Spanning both industry and academia, we proudly bring together insights from Bath University, the BBC VR Hub, Limina Immersive, Story Central Limited, Passport, Raucous and beyond. How though can the magic of your 3D XR worlds be more effectively communicated via 2D media? Emphasizing not the newness of the technology, but the transformation of the audience's state of mind, our work is all based on research-informed and audience-tested principles. Thanks to grants from Story Futures Academy and Bristol and Bath Creative R+D, we have led on the marketing for cutting-edge XR projects, in which we form new promotional strategies, bibles, toolkits, campaigns, and course materials. We now support XR creators and businesses from different corners of the XR landscape to better communicate with their audiences about the magic of immersive content.
Cool. So hopefully, the challenge in research terms, I guess, hopefully is quite clear, right? So the immersive sector's growing, of course, at a fast rate, taking off in some sectors perhaps more quickly than others, but generally mass market adoption. There we go. Mass market adoption remains comparatively low, right? And this is partly, I would argue, about marketing, or kind of more specifically, it might be about bad marketing, right? So research tells us that there's still many audiences out there that would associate VR with often quite sort of stereotypical, sometimes even gendered imagery. So, quite often this idea of like far off, futuristic sort of alien technology, right? And I think this kind of makes sense, given that so much of the sort of imagery that we're used to seeing in terms of publicizing and promoting these technologies is specifically that, in terms of alien kind of sci-fi technologies, or people in headsets, or looking at mobile phones, for example. What I would argue, the immersive sector really needs is actually kind of a new way of communicating XR, one that is really specific to kind of what's unique about XR, what it can do, the affordances that kind of Mandy and Ian were talking about, but audiences, in terms of what audiences actually value about it, and how can we kind of pull some of those insights out. So our project last year, which was funded by Story Futures, aimed to at least kind of make a start, I guess, on this idea of a new promotional language. So this was a project that I did with Danaë Lammerman from UCL and BBC, Catherine Allen from Limina, Alison Norrington from Story Central, and Naomi Smythe from Bath Spa. So, the research really was quite wide-ranging. It was comprised of everything from kind of sector reports, audience insight, interviews, lit reviews, semiotics, questionnaires. We also had an industry panel from people from BBC R+D and Rewind and Passport. And essentially, we worked with 3 partners to create research-informed and audience-tested marketing campaigns for 3 live XR projects. So those were Anagram's Goliath, which is a forthcoming VR documentary about living with schizophrenia that's going to launch on Oculus very soon, actually. Studio Maguire's The Invited, which is an AR Kirigami kind of pop-up book adaptation of the Dracula story, which will launch later in the year. And then finally, the National Gallery's Virtual Veronese, which is a VR exhibit that transports you back to the 16th century. So the key kind of output, I guess, from this work was the Immersive Promotion Bible. So this is sort of a big resource that kind of aims to provide a bit of a roadmap, essentially, for professionals and students in terms of how do you create a marketing campaign for a VR or AR experience. So we sort of touch on everything from kind of targeting immersive audiences to communicating immersion itself, thinking a little bit about immersive expectations and questions of kind of fear and apprehension, And this is currently free to download from immersivepromotion.com, which is our website. So I'm just going to kind of quickly pull out just a handful of key lessons, I guess, in terms of how to promote XR to new audiences. So lesson one is, this sort of promoting emotions, not technologies. So the audience insight and kind of evaluation that we did sort of taught us really that creating a stronger or more effective or more compelling kind of marketing campaign for XR really starts with an understanding of what XR actually is. And I know that sounds really obvious, but like if we forget the technology for a second, which is usually the thing that tends to get foregrounded in the promotional material, if we forget that and think about actually what it is and what it offers and what its value is, we kind of argued that we can distill this down into 3 promises that it makes to audiences. So these being like some combination of a new way of seeing the world, which I think Mandy was hinting at, a new way of connecting with other people, and also a very kind of unique personal experience that can be quite profound. So at the same time, some of the kind of audience insight that we kind of gathered, which informed this, so some of this was kind of gathered through Story Futures, also kind of in partnership with Limina Immersive as well, shows that what audiences really kind of value most about XR is always how it makes you feel, always. Specifically that it feels real, that it can provide a really kind of unique form of engagement that can mean a range of different things. And also, if managed well, that it allows you to feel safe. And of course, that's an interesting one because safety is something that puts people off about XR if they kind of don't necessarily know what it is. But at the same time, actually, once you're in and you do feel secure, it can actually enhance that feeling of safety and security. So within that, we then sort of stripped XR down just to like very sort of basic, simple categories or elements or characteristics. So essentially, again, forget the technology, but what is it? What does it actually offer? What's unique about these things? So things like proximity, right? That's the ability to sort of like go up to something and almost pick it up. That really kind of uncanny sense of scale or space that you might feel in a VR experience, for example. The role of sound and the kind of multi-directionality of that freedom, that ability to sort of wander and move around and so on and so forth, right? So the thinking is that XR as a thing, as an experience, is of course very difficult to communicate if you can't put somebody in a headset and see it for themselves. But if we understand the elements and the characteristics and the emotions that actually make up an XR experience, and again, really try and foreground what it is that audiences value about it and it's memorable for, then it becomes possible to communicate those things strategically and creatively. So here's just some of the kind of example imagery, I guess, that we kind of mocked up for the 3 campaigns that I mentioned, like trying to visualize, if you like, these categories. So things like immersive proximity or immersive scale and space. So, you can see the idea here, right? So things like worlds within worlds and never-ending spaces, juxtapositions in this kind of uncanny, large and small kind of sense. And the images you can see here also generally tested best on audiences who were completely new to this stuff. So in terms of not having tried, VR before, but actually it kind of doing the job in terms of intriguing them knowing that it is promoting VR and instilling kind of some degree of intrigue or excitement. Lesson 2, which I think was really key actually, was promote XR as magic and not sci-fi. So the famous, Arthur C. Clarke quote, which of course everyone is familiar with in some way, from 1962, goes that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And in 2021, a Nielsen survey found that consumers are generally speaking most interested in using XR if it's useful. So if it assists and enhances their kind of very everyday lives and has a very functional purpose, right? So in other words, we need to reposition XR, I would argue, culturally, not as science fiction, but instead almost as the kind of magical counterpart to our very normal everyday lives. So in other words, it's Harry Potter, it's not Star Trek. That's kind of where I would argue a lot of the marketing tends to make a mistake. And adopting this kind of magical imagery and metaphors was really kind of a key approach for us. So like adding like magical elements on top of sort of, people's very sort of everyday home lives, for example, magical doorways or portals into sort of quite new and impossible spaces. And I think this, on the one hand, it really gets to the heart of kind of what's quite unique about XR as an experience. But more to the point, it's familiar, it's accessible, it's easy to navigate. And it starts to shift the marketing away from science fiction, and even starts to shift it away from the technology itself, and starts to think about actually what it makes you feel. So here's just a quick example of a poster image that proved most popular with audiences for communicating the National Gallery's Virtual Realities experience. So in other words, communicating that it is a VR experience. And as you can see, very much inspired by this logic of kind of Harry Potter style portals into kind of magical, impossible worlds and spaces. Another example here, slightly more complicated, this one. So this was the poster that we did for The Invited, which was the AR Dracula story. And it was kind of the result of quite an audience testing and fiddling, really. So while sort of trying to apply some of these research ideas. So we found that like things like animation and filters, so like the bats on the left, was kind of the most obvious way of signaling AR without actually saying it, but also signaling screen media, which was important. But that, when we tested it, generally appealed almost exclusively to younger men. Whereas the black and white image on the right, so this is like the pop-up book of the experience, obviously with an audience member kind of trapped inside. It was a way of signaling almost like escape rooms and immersive theatre, which also was kind of important to the experience. And it was based on these ideas of like scale and space and proximity that I was talking about. But it almost appealed to the opposite audience. It was kind of mostly women over 45. So essentially, when we kind of put them together in as kind of rigorous a fashion as that, it had a 20% click rate when we kind of put it out as a sponsored ad, so pretty high. And more to the point, the audience was much more diverse. So it was 54% men, 46 women, ages all the way up from 16 to 65 plus. This emphasis on kind of magical imagery, which is obviously a visual approach, also kind of shaped the language that we use. So like as a team, we kind of encountered all of these problems, right, in terms of how do you describe XR, like literally how do you put words on a page that kind of give a sense of what it is and intrigue people and etc. So we experimented with loads of sort of different approaches. I think actually we were least successful when it came to doing this via written word. I think we were much more successful with visuals and media. But interestingly, kind of not using text-specific language. So in other words, not calling the thing VR or not calling the thing AR or some form of that. Generally, overall, across all of the evaluation, it opened up the audience and engagement by up to 40%. But importantly, as long as that kind of clarity was given later. So in other words, if we kind of relied more on the metaphors and the magic early on, and then provided more detail and explanation about the technology and the role and so on and so forth later on, it generally kind of worked to intrigue and engage much more audiences. But even without any sort of techie type language at all within this sort of stuff, overall, across all of the different campaigns, the imagery was deemed clear and persuasive, as you can see, 69%, with that rising to 78% amongst 35 to 55s. The final lesson is kind of my personal favorite, really, because it's the one I didn't at all see coming. I think it's really fascinating, is keep audiences feeling immersed for longer. So we found that when marketing VR in particular, promotional content that tries to almost keep people feeling immersed after the actual VR thing has actually ended and people have actually taken the headset off, etc., could be a way of building new audiences, right? So this idea of creating what we called almost like post-experience mementos or totems, to use Sharon Clark's term, that are really about bottling people's mood change following the immersion and trying to kind of rekindle the memory that they have of feeling immersed. So, we just heard kind of Ian, talking about all of the kind of psychology behind immersion, what's unique about how it makes you feel, etc. Right? So we're all familiar with these ideas of the impact that XR can have on how you learn, how you remember, how you feel. So this is really about taking that, that research, which does seem to be pretty clear in terms of its impact psychologically, in terms of mood and memory, and really just using that as a quite bespoke, innovative form of promotion for promoting and marketing XR. So for example, making like these sorts of AR filters, for example. So can you guys still hear me?
You went just a moment ago, but you're back now.
Okay, my laptop's slightly frozen, so I can't play these, but I'll just quickly talk them through. So the filter on the left for Goliath, kind of what it does is it's like that, trying to normalize this idea of VR. So literally almost putting like a digital VR headset on, and it sort of transforms the environment around you into a gaming world. So this is kind of the actual immersive world of Goliath. So it's about actually allowing you to enter that VR world, not without a headset, but actually kind of through a mobile phone. And then the one on the right does the same sort of thing. So it's about allowing you to go into the immersive worlds of these experiences simply through a mobile phone, rather than needing kind of an expensive headset. So it's about like thinking about VR as like a promotional bridge to VR. So AR is a bridge to VR, but it's also about thinking kind of AR as a slightly more accessible way of engaging audiences into XR technologies, and more to the point, making them feel a little bit more normalized, a little bit more kind of everyday, a little bit more accessible, whilst retaining those ideas of magic and wonder. I'm going to leave it there, and I might just have to dip out and reboot if I can't.
Okay.
Open my mouth, but I will be back. So thanks.
I won't ask any questions to you, Matt. I won't save the horrible ones for you. I'll say we'll carry on and just join as you can.
Cheers.
Thank you, everyone. Fantastic set of talks, and really great to hear a snapshot of the research that is going on within your different projects. I can see I can see quite a lot of questions coming into the chat now, but I'm going to, as the chair, I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'll move to the questions in the chat. So thanks for people putting those in, because I can see them mounting up there, and we'll try and work through as many as we can. So yeah, I really enjoyed your talks, and I wanted to ask a sort of a fairly general question, which is, I know in the Create Lab we're doing work on VR and immersion with many of you, actually all of you here, we're working. And one of the real challenges for us recently has obviously been when we can't do, a lot of our studies are in labs or what we call in the wild. And obviously over the last year, that's been very difficult, and it's brought up lots of challenges, but actually some really interesting opportunities about doing, sort of looking how we can reach audiences online, and thinking about different ways that actually we go about our methodologies. And you've presented very different methodologies today as well, which I find really interesting. So I just wanted to pose to each of you, just give you a couple of minutes, so just briefly, what are the challenges, what are the real challenges and opportunities that you're seeing at the moment in the particular area that you're working in? And I'll just pick on Ian, because he was the first one to talk. He's had a bit of a breather. And then we'll move to Mandy, and hopefully Matt will be back by then. But if not, we'll go to questions in the chat. Sorry, in the Q&A.
So it's a great question. Like you, we've been really struggling to recruit participants and to do studies during lockdown with restrictions. I think I'd like to touch on a longer term issue, which I think is interesting. I think so. Most of the VR work that's done, and the work we've done with screen-based media, has tended to be a solitary experience. You know, one person experiencing something on their own. Much of our audience experiences in the past has been collective, groups of people getting together to experience something together. So the cinema or the theatre or a sports event or something like that. I'm interested to see how much we've unlearnt our behaviour as a result of being locked down for a year. Audience behaviour is very stereotypical, and it's clearly learned, particularly collective audience experience. You know, we don't routinely chat in the cinema like we might do while we're watching television. An audience that's watching a sports event behaves in a very different way than the audience who's watching a string quartet. I think there's a really interesting question about whether audience will have to reconfigure and relearn those cultural behaviours, collective audiences, and whether we'll do it easily or not. And so that's something that really interests me. I think audiences might have forgotten how to be audiences, at least those collective ones. And I've traveled around the world, and I've been an audience member in lots of different countries, and in different countries, audiences behave differently as well. And I think that again suggests that these are culturally learned things, that they're not innate in any sense, of course. So that really interests me. I mean, it's not something I know quite how to study yet, but I think it's something that I think we should be looking for. Yeah,
that sounds really exciting to me. And I've been thinking some of the same things, and the fact that it's going to be different conventions as we move back to what we might call normality, with the social distancing and face masks even going to change how we are as audiences. So yeah, no, great, thank you, Ian. And I'll move over to Matt and Dee. And Matt, I have a bit of time to think, what are the challenges and opportunities, Matt? Over to Mandy.
Sure. So yeah, interesting that Ian picks up on kind of collectivity, sociality, because that was clearly one of the key findings in our VR research. So thinking, I'll think about another challenge. For me, I think a really significant challenge comes out of the area of ethics that was highlighted in relation to people's concerns in our research, their concerns around trauma, psychological concerns around persuasion, propaganda. And there are, and you know, from other work we've done within our project, we know there are many other ethical issues that arise around virtual reality, in particular around data and privacy. So, for example, so I guess my challenge would be about how we keep the public interest at the center of our research around immersion going forward. You know, in a context where, you know, development's being driven by, you know, by Silicon Valley, as we know, where UKRI are very focused on economic growth. So there are these drivers on us as researchers, you know, to push forward. But I think we, you know, so how, the question is, the challenge is how we keep public interest, social good at the heart of our work on immersion, especially since some of the issues that have been emerging are going to be accompanied by others, you know, soon. You know, Thomas Metzinger talks about technological confluence, I think is his expression, around how the new problematics are going to arise as AI meets VR, as, you know, virtual humans and, you know, avatar, you know, I can't think of the word for avatars that are very, you know, hyper real avatars start emerging. So these ethical challenges are escalating. So how do we center the public interest in the work we do around immersion as we go forward?
Thanks, Mandy. And I can see some questions you'll get in a moment, which one of them's around the ethics and deep fakes. So I think you've tied really nicely to that. Thank you. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, apologies, I froze. My laptop was kind of overheating quite. I'm amazed it's still standing. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think for me, in terms of the big challenge really for me it is around audience, but it's around expectations, right? And I think all three of the presentations picked up on it in slightly different ways. Whether it was Mandy with this idea of there's a complete clash between the idea of VR and the home, and Ian talking about at what points do people drift in and out and get bored and these sorts of things, right? I mean, obviously the big challenge with immersive is, you know, to think what I was talking about, is it is very hard to tell people what it is. And it's like, if you think about any other equivalent cultural form, it's either easier to do it because you can put it on a screen, or even if you can't, like, even if it's something incredibly visceral like a roller coaster, you can literally stand by the roller coaster and you can watch others, and then you can decide for yourself. You know, in the case of me, you can go no chance, and then you come back, you have a drink an hour later, and suddenly it looks a much better proposition, right? But with VR, it's that sense of actually, well, what is it, and actually, how am I going to feel? Am I going to look silly? And what will I need to do? And, you know, all of these kinds of questions. That is a massive challenge, which obviously we're trying to think about a little bit. And I know there's other kind of research going on that's around this idea of expectation and communicating that to people. Not just in a sense of, okay, we need to put it on the website and give a sense of actually what it's going to be, but how can we do that creatively and imaginatively and quite distinctly? And I don't think anybody's cracked that yet. And until that happens, I think there's always going to be a smaller audience until we can really sort of open up. This is literally, what is it? You know, literally, what is it? And also, how is it different to everything else that's going on in your life, right? In terms of, I suppose, another challenge as well is around, like, industrially how this stuff gets positioned. You know, so I'm thinking Mandy's talking about VR documentary, right? We might have this sort of VR theatre, etc. And it is an interesting question as to, like, is that the way to go? Like, to almost position immersive as an extension of existing media? I mean, on the one hand, that should open it up to bigger audiences, but on the other hand, does that limit its potential in terms of it being a new creative form in and of itself? And I think that's another interesting question as well, actually, is how industrially, how do we kind of navigate that a bit? Do we kind of fall back on it being an amplification of something else, or actually is it completely new? And if so, do we risk, you know, minimizing audiences, etc.? I think in terms of opportunities, I mean, I suppose this is, I would say this, but I think there's something really interesting about immersive tech, as well as it being, you know, a thing in and of itself, as being a really interesting way of finding and engaging audiences. You know, if it does have this ability to capture attention and keep you emotionally invested and allow you to feel things that you've never kind of seen before, then actually that can be a fantastic way of actually finding an audience for something else. So, you know, being an engagement strategy for other forms of media or other cultural forms. And obviously that's going on a bit already, you know, things like AR, fashion apps, etc. But I think we're only scratching the surface of that. And it just feels like another enormous potential application that can really do quite wonderful things in terms of just finding new audiences, capturing new attention in new ways, and also keeping us engaged as well. You know, the media landscape is so fragmented and there's so much content that actually we kind of need new strategies to keep audiences invested. And to me, that's immersive technologies. So I think there's real opportunities there.
Thank you. Thanks. Now I'm going to, you've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to, we won't be able to cover them all, but I'll try and get a few out to you. So I'm going to throw the first one to Mandy because it's actually related to the ethics. And there was someone called James in the chat. I only caught it was James and I didn't see his surname, so I'm not sure, I wasn't sure if I got it. Hopefully I've presented your question well, James. It was the ethical issue about deep fakes, and he's asking, what can be done, I suppose, because you were talking about people being in I'm reading into the question, but being in non-fiction environments, and what can be done to make sure that VR is used responsibly and ethically. So there's a sense of truthfulness about what you're experiencing.
James, I wish there was an easy answer to that, but there isn't, right? We're seeing this kind of rapid development of new novel, you know, emerging media technologies, regulation, government regulation around all these digital media offerings lags many years behind public, you know, their availability to the public. It's not simple. And I don't think we can, I don't know what your word was, guarantee ethical applications of these platforms, which is why it's a serious, you know, which is why the question of public interest is pressing and important. There are things we can do, you know, Key and I are in a you know, work in feeding into a white paper, US white paper through IEE. What does that stand for, Danae? It's an engineering conference in the States where, you know, big piece of work to produce a white paper defining some of the ethical challenges, but it's complicated, and there isn't a simple answer. So that's why I foreground this as an area of concern and one that we need to keep on our agenda.
Thank you, Mandy. I'm going to quickly pass on to Ian. There's a few questions for Ian about the sort of methods and measures that you talked about, and I'm going to pick up on Jane's question. Are different methods and measures used for e.g. theatre, art, listening to music? So are there a variety of different measures based on the different types of content that you're looking at?
There are a number. I mean, the sort of standard thing to do, of course, is to give people a questionnaire or do a structured interview, and that's a really valuable method. The methods that I talked about and some of the methods we've been developing, we've tried to develop them so that they can be used across different types of content and different experiences. And this is a lovely chance for me to plug the My World project, because as part of My World, which is a new project coming on the stream very soon in a big way in this space, we will be producing hopefully an instrumented cinema, so we can record people's galvanic skin response and heart rate of a group of people in a real cinema experience in real time. Now, those are the same measures that we use as people sit on their own watching a television, and we'll have mobile systems like that. So potentially someone could watch a play at the Old Vic and have exactly the same system on them, or go and watch a football match and have the same system on them. And we can record heart rate and galvanic skin response. So although there are different methods, I think those different methods are being applied in different locations for technical reasons, not for fundamental scientific reasons. So there's a real opportunity, I think, in the next few years to get some convergence so that we can compare experiences across different, using the same methods.
Thanks, Ian, and that was a good plug for my world, but also I'm just going to follow up there because John's asked a question to you as well about measurement of experience, so we'll just follow up on that. So it's a long question, I'll just read it out. If the measurement of experience focuses on a limited range of physical data that fundamentally expresses excitement, doesn't that mean all content becomes a Marvel movie, i.e. that excitement could become the key thrill-seeking aesthetic rather than, for example, memory or changing your belief or any of the effects that you had in your first slide?
So I think excitement probably is one dimension of immersion, but it isn't the whole story, and our measures don't just tap into excitement. So it's true that your heart rate may well be a more pure measure of excitement than our dual task measure. Our dual task measure does capture that sense of, I'm so interested in this and engrossed in it, in the content, that all my attention resources are on it. And that doesn't have to be about excitement. You know, I'm not necessarily excited about a bird watching book. Well, I look through and think, oh, I saw one of those in 1977 on a walk in Sussex or whatever. You know, that's not an excitement response, but it's still an immersive response. And so what I don't want to do, and I'm absolutely not doing, and it's a good opportunity to say this in the question, is I don't want anything we do to restrict the creative activity. You know, it's absolutely fine creatively to confuse, bemuse, almost lose your audience, decide not to immerse them, not to engage them. If that's the artistic expression you want to make, that's fine. But what we can do is give you a measure of that, or to try at least to give a measure of what's happening psychologically to your audience when that happens. It's up to the creative people to decide what they want to do with that information.
Thank you, that's great. And actually I'm going to move on to Matt, because following on slightly from that, oh, my questions have just moved as I was talking. I had a good question for you there that's just moved up my screen. Sorry, Matt, it's disappeared. Let me find it again. Oh yeah, here we go. Knowing a lot of people, so Rebecca's asked, knowing a lot of people won't go to the VR pieces because it's unfamiliar or scary, how do you get them to engage?
That's the whole question, isn't it? That's the whole aim. I mean, what we were trying to sort of think about was whether like the promotion can actually be a runway, right? So actually structuring a campaign in such a way that it starts off in the least immersive way, and actually it's like breadcrumbs, and then step by step you're kind of leading people in. So like, for example, with the Dracula one, we picked out like a number of themes that were essentially like psychological or emotional states of immersion. So we had seeing, we had kind of believing and becoming, and then there was another one. So the idea was that actually like becoming was the end of that scale. Like you're literally now becoming the thing and you're going into it, and then seeing is kind of the opposite end of the scale. So it was about actually trying to structure a campaign in such a way that we're thinking about what platforms, you know, video, binaural sound, apps, avatars, posters, even social media, that could actually start to just lure people in a little bit. So there's nothing off-putting, there's nothing alien, there's something quite magical and captivating. But you're also not asking people to do much, at least at the start. You're just asking people to invest and see something. And then it kind of moves into, right, now how can we ask them to believe in this magical thing? And then what might that look like? And then that becomes the next phase. And then actually, how can we get them to play and participate? So maybe creating things like avatars where they get to sort of like become a character within this kind of world. So we're still not asking them to go into it or put anything on, but just mess around on your phone and start to kind of think about what that might be like. And then so on and so forth. And by the end, it was the filter stuff, which I think was when I froze, where like you can literally put yourself through your phone into that kind of VR world. So you really get a sense without putting any headset on at all of actually what it would look like, but also more to the point what it would feel like to be in it and whether you would be comfortable, etc. So that we felt like was the closest step towards, in that case, putting on a VR headset. But at the same time, I imagine if we'd have done that at the start of the campaign, nobody would have done it, right? So it was very much about thinking, I'm not a psychologist, but it was very much about thinking psychologically, what's the least immersive state, what's the most, and then what's that kind of journey into it that's, as I say, like breadcrumbs into the journey. That was kind of our approach, really.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, Matt, because in a lot of studies that we're doing, we look at agency, and a lot of the research shows that if you don't have as much agency in VR, you might not be as engaged. But actually, you're looking at the process where you move to more agency as you get more familiar, which I think that's really interesting. Probably something we can talk about as well at some stage. I'm going to move on. Thank you for that. I'm conscious of time. It's gone very quickly. Mandy, I'm just going to finish, and if you could answer this reasonably briefly, so I've got time to just finish up. There's some nice questions about the home study. We can't cover them all, but there's one here that says, would you say, it's from Rebecca, would you say we should be trying to figure out new ways to push VR into homes, or shift focus on out-of-home VR experience instead, like going to the cinema would be?
If I were a producer of immersive experiences, after doing that household study, I'd be thinking about public exhibition. You know, I just think there's a much clearer fit right now, and looking at things like heritage work in the museum sector. You know, you've got, you know, so yeah, I mean, that's my kind of my personal take on it. But also the idea of pushing something on people, it doesn't sit well with me. As I say, my questions are how we allow people to pursue the media they need and want, rather than pushing something which they seem unwilling to engage with, in that context at least. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. It's 1:43, so we've just got a couple of minutes left, and I really enjoyed the discussion. We could have discussed it for a lot longer. It's always the way, isn't it? But I really enjoyed listening to the snapshots of your research and having this brief discussion, which obviously will carry on in many forms. And I want to thank everyone for attending the panel. I want to thank Mandy, Ian and Matt for being a fantastic set of speakers. Juliet and Will for doing, you haven't seen them, but they've been in the background just helping us, and for the cluster for all the support. If you're interested to know more about the cluster, anybody on the call, we will be having an event on the 23rd of April across the whole cluster, so feel free to follow up on that. The next part of this series will be Tim Cole, and he'll be hosting a panel on the 28th of April, looking at academia and bridging academia and the creative industries. And Mandy's also hosting an event next week. There's lots on. Also on immersive audiences as part of the iDocs, and we'll put the link in the text text chat for you.
It's tomorrow, in fact.
Oh, sorry, is it tomorrow? It's tomorrow. That's in next week. It's tomorrow. Gosh, so that's close. So if people are free tomorrow, please tune into that. And it just leaves me to say, yeah, a big thank you to everyone. And this session will be recorded. So if you know, people can watch it, or if they want to, in your labs or groups, if they haven't had a chance to come. Thanks very much, and goodbye, everyone.